Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our final session of the day, plugging away at long-term change, where we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so looking at the water sector, the resilience, the robustness, and some of the challenges that we face, both globally and specifically in the UK. I'm joined by three great panelists who are here to provide their wisdom and insight on this topic. We have Gordon Rogers, Head of Long-Term Strategy at United Utilities, Stephanie Hurry, Head of Water Efficiency Engagement at Waterwise, and the impressively titled Global Water Leader at Arup, Mark Fletcher. So welcome, everybody. Obviously, we'll have the conversation going on here, but do feel free to join in as we go along in the chat function on the right-hand side. Do put in any questions that you have there, and I will look to put them to the panelists as we go through. So to kick things off, Gordon, do you just want to set a little bit of context around some of the challenges that we face around water?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So we've got three good different perspectives on water this afternoon, at least three, probably more than three. But just a few, I think, interesting statistics that maybe set some context for the scale of the challenge and the opportunity, and just how important water is really to everyday society, but perhaps quite hidden from a lot of us in what we do. So kind of a few stats around two themes. One was just the scale of the challenge with the changing climate. And how integral that is to water issues and services, and tailored to the Northwest, and then equally around the hidden water in what we import in everything we buy and we consume, which I always find really scary and fascinating. But on climate change, a few key messages really. One, just the climate has already changed, and from a United Utilities water provider background, we're feeling that firsthand. We've already had about a degree of average global climate change, and in the Northwest, that's meant all of the top 10 hottest years on record have occurred since 2002. The warming trend is absolutely clear in the data. That is undeniable, I would argue, and half of the wettest years have occurred since 2000. So it's definitely getting wetter. And as a water utility, and in the Northwest, we've had plenty of experience of flood events that are really quite significant and disrupting communities. Left, right and centre, far too much. So that there is definitely some change that we need to respond to. Secondly, there is more change coming. So just looking, the UK is lucky enough to have some of the best climate projections in the world from the Met Office, the Hadley Centre and various other partners. And themes around too little water. And we had a really hot, dry summer back in 2018, and there was starting to be itchings around hosepipe bans and that usual conversation. But if we roll that forward, the average kind of trajectory that we're on at the moment, we can expect broadly 13% less water on average during a year by 2050, and a very frightening 24% by the end of the century. And there's a lot of range around that, but those are kind of the mid projections for the carbon trajectory that we're currently on as a society. And I think if you imagine taking a quarter of our water out of supply, with the growing population, over 1 million people, well over 1 million more people expected in the Northwest by 2050, you can see compounding pressures on the water environment and water demand, with increasing pollution and all the nature challenge as well thrown in, all compounding together to give us some real problems. And then if you compound that with, I guess we don't feel we've got highly resilient water services, and it feels quite green and lush in the Northwest typically. So we don't often think about challenges. I don't think anybody particularly gets up and worries that their tap is not going to turn and flow. Very rare that we interrupt a supply in the UK these days. That's of course very different globally, but we kind of take that for granted here in the UK, and rightly so. 100+ years of investment. But if we just think about how inefficient we have become with water off the back of that kind of reliance, and perhaps to be provocative, taking it for granted, we have an average in the Northwest, and it's broadly the same across the UK, per capita consumption around 140 litres per person per day of water use. That can be and should be markedly lower. There are plenty of global comparisons where that is a lot better, and it has been steadily increasing over decades in the UK, despite all the efforts. So just to give you a scale of things, United Utilities, and of course that's not all the water provision. There are people taking water directly from the environment too, but from a public water service, 1.8 billion litres of water treated collected, treated, supplied every single day to the 7.3 million people across the Northwest and all the businesses. Huge scale, huge infrastructure, huge demand and pressure on the natural environment, huge opportunity for efficiency. And then lastly, we then import a whole lot more water from outside of the UK. So just to pick a couple there, do a quick Google on water footprinting, all sorts of lovely stats pop up. But your pair of jeans has about 1,500 litres of water in a typical pair of jeans, which I find quite shocking. Or my favourite one, just your classic cup of coffee, has 132 litres of water to get you that cup of coffee. If you consider the transport, the growing, and then actually filling your kettle way beyond the 100, 200 mils in your cup. And similarly, beef is the most frightening one. Kilogram of beef, 15,000 litres of water. So there's another drive to the more veganism, or at least the flexitarian movement of just eating less meat, that has huge environmental and social benefits. Anyway, as you see, I get excited by these things, and I could talk on, but there's a sprinkling to set some context.
Well, I find that idea of where water gets used in things that we don't think of as water and causing supply problems really interesting. I was reading about the semiconductor challenge, which is the thing that's keeping cars from being built across the world, particularly in Europe, and causing all sorts of knock-on effects in that supply chain. And the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer in Taiwan is spending £20 million this year to truck in water so that they can keep going with what they're doing because of the Taiwan's water shortage problems. And that just helped me be reminded of how small the world is. And just because in the UK we're okay when we turn our taps on, doesn't mean that we're not affected. Mark, if I come to you on that global question, how do we kind of grasp the scale of the global challenge and that it is a real issue, given that, as Gordon says, when we turn our taps on here, the water pretty much always comes out?
It's difficult. When we think from a global perspective, I think we were involved in looking at, because more people now live in cities than rural areas, it's quite that transition. We thought, well, do you sort of, on your 80-20 rule, do you look at how things impact people in cities? Whether with climate change we start having too much water or too little water, or more shocks and stresses. So we started to look at cities, but with a control. We looked at Greater Manchester and Hull, but we also were looking at places like Cape Town that experienced huge drought, or Mexico that's getting large-scale subsidence with abstractions, Miami that's getting sort of storm surges and an intense storm. So a whole range of different places, really, to look at how do those extremes affect populations that they're either in the global north or in the global south. And as you do that, you actually learn that the solution to most of this lies within the people and the communities, and building resilience within those communities. When Gordon mentioned, I think, 140 litres a person per day, in Cape Town, as they were struggling and really getting to the point where they thought we're really going to go below the point at which our reservoirs have effectively run dry, what they call day zero, they introduced 50 litres per person per day. And interestingly, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, so that's just an organisation that's looking around the world around things that are sustainable. They're sort of quite agent provocateur of issues relating to sustainability. They've just run some work looking at the 50 litre home. So what would that look and feel like? And what are the sorts of things that you might do that would change what you do? And whilst there are technological fixes, there's also behavioural fixes. But the other thing we experience around the world is culturally, some people have different, use water for different things in different ways. Depending on the culture, we're part of the system, we're seen as either part of water, or integral part of water, is an integral part of life. I know when I've been with the Maori indigenous people in New Zealand, I've never seen such reverence for water compared to other places I've been, where a sort of Western profligate use of water. So, it's really important when you haven't got any. And we take for granted the fact that we have access to water, where we still don't have a city in India that provides water 24 hours. I think be careful the things you do take for granted, because with climate change and increasing extremes, I think we're going to find increasingly more shocks and stresses. And it's important that we have resilience to those, and building community resilience rather than just physical resilience is increasingly an important element. Yeah,
I think we only need to look at somewhere like California and the problems that they're having that are seemingly very difficult for them to solve. To say, well, sometimes it can be easy to look on the list and go, well, Jordan's got problems, Pakistan's got problems, Iran's got problems, but when we see America and California, it does make it seem like it's something that we need to do a lot of. Stephanie, water-wise, you're very much responsible for engagement and I suppose getting people to understand these messages. How difficult is that to get people to sort of embrace the agenda?
Very. I think globally, people understand when you talk about, Australia and Africa and places like that. When you talk about drought, people understand that. They kind of picture the dry earth scene. They picture, day zero in South Africa, and it resonates with them. But when you talk about drought or water scarcity here in the UK, people think, well, you're mad. It rains all the time. I think the problem is the perception that the UK is a very rainy, kind of wet, grey country, and particularly even when we do have dry periods. For example, if you look at last year, we had a very, very dry May. I think it was the driest May on record. We had demand shot through the roof, so it was the highest demand in 10 years as well. But then you follow that with very wet periods. And again, this year, we experienced the driest April on record in 2021, but it was followed by the wettest May on record. So it's very difficult to kind of highlight the issues with sort of droughts or water scarcity, because most people will initially think of other countries, and when you relate it back, they'll think, oh, but it's been raining the whole time, and they won't think, oh, the month before was very, very dry. They'll just think of the immediate sort of grey, drizzly weather. So I think it's really hard to kind of capture people's imaginations and capture their minds around the fact that we too experience these sorts of issues here in the UK. And if we don't continue to sort of try to reduce our water use, then we will experience real water scarce issues by as early as 2025, definitely by 2040. And one of the stats I find shocking is the fact that by 2040, we know that more than half of our summers will probably be hotter than the 2003 heatwave, which could leave our rivers with 50 to 80% less water, which of course will affect not only wildlife but the environment, but also drinking water, because that's where our water is obviously, a lot of it is abstracted from. So it's a real key issue to us here in the UK, just as much as it is globally.
And Gordon, how resilient is our water supply chain?
Well, great question, and something I grapple with every day, basically. So I'm often challenged by my colleagues of being far too doom and gloom because of the scale of the challenge we've just outlined. But I guess we should start by celebrating success. As we've said, people in the UK today, they do not worry about when they turn the tap on in general. Very, very rare to be interrupted. We flush the toilet without even thinking about where it goes. All of those things we import, and we're a relatively rich nation. We'll import it in, and if we need to pay a bit more, we will do that. So today, I don't think we need to be fundamentally worried. We clearly have challenges in places, as we've all outlined, and there have been significant events, and I struggle to think of anything worse. If you were one of the poor people in some of these flood events that we've had over recent years, the impact on that. We know people in Hull after 2007, some of them were out of their home for well over a year. The stress and the disruption to their lives is quite fundamental. So generally good, but not perfect. Roll that forward, as Stephanie was saying there, for 2040 and certainly into the second half of this century. I think it really starts to get quite frightening, especially when, as you touched on, it's not just about the UK and sorting our own kind of direct supply here in the Northwest. We can presumably afford to invest in that. We will invest in that. Billions go in through the water sector every year and so on. But I guess I'm most worried about the international supply chain and everything we are importing, but both in a sense of will they be disrupted through events, but equally through a moral stance of we are effectively buying water from those other communities that least have it, and are we comfortable with that as a society? Shouldn't we be much more resilient and thinking about that kind of global citizen kind of view? But so there's that global perspective that I think is deteriorating, and there's, is water the new gold, the new oil? You can see if California and all of these communities are starting to really struggle with their water, let's roll that forward. You can see that. I can see wars over water in the second half of this century, absolutely. Maybe we've had them already, actually, in disguise. So you can see that global context. In the UK, there is a lot to do, and it is quite systemic. We still benefit from the Victorian investment, but that means we have quite archaic, outdated systems. We certainly wouldn't do what we have today if we were starting from scratch. Combined sewer systems where all of the road runoff and all the clean surface water then gets thrown in with the sewage to make it completely useless and add to the problem that we then have to treat at the treatment works. And similarly on the water systems, we only have one source of water. It's all treated to the highest possible standard, and yet only about 3% of it actually we drink. A lot of it just goes straight down the sink and straight down the toilet without really even touching any activity. So, quite fundamentally, it is not a sustainable system. And I wonder how, when water is relatively very cheap in this country, we don't pay an awful lot. I know there's an affordability challenge, don't get me wrong. I entirely recognise that some people really do struggle to pay their water, and we should absolutely focus on that. But generally, a lot of people don't actually know the price of their water bill, and they wouldn't notice whether it changed £5–10 in a year. And increasingly, a lot of customers tell us they want to pay more to sort these things, and they would rather avoid long-term challenges and start to kind of smooth out an investment challenge ahead. We see that quite loud and clear, whilst absolutely we need to protect quite a strong number, maybe a quarter of society is quite struggling to pay for their water bill. So there's kind of differentiating these different parts of society and who can pay and how and so on, so that we don't just put it all on the poorest. But there are plenty of challenges. Technically, we can absolutely work through that. How do we fund it? How do we best do it? How do we do it without pouring lots of concrete, which is carbon, which is adding to the climate challenge? And Mark has loads of global experience, and increasingly here in the UK of kind of nature-based approaches, behavioural approaches, which really fix the problem at source and ease all of the pressures. And as you say, if we could get 140 litres down to below 100 litres, massively eases all of the consequences and the knock-on pressures downstream. So we can go into all sorts of detail, hopefully, in the discussion, but plenty to go at that we should be doing, and the value of water, for me, fundamentally needs to increase. Not necessarily the cost of water, but the value of water absolutely needs to be pushed up our agenda.
Stephanie, how do we approach that? How do we make people more aware of the amount of water they're using and to start thinking of it as a valuable commodity?
I guess in terms of, so the first part would be to get a water meter. I think it's very hard to monitor what you use or understand how much you use if you don't have a water meter, because you're obviously just paying a flat rate. So I think having a water meter, at least you have control over how much you use, and therefore if you reduce how much you use, you're obviously saving water and money. But I also think the second part is the harder parts, because as Gordon sort of mentioned, water is relatively cheap. If you compare it to energy bills, for example, water is very cheap. And I think even if you do have a water meter, if you're happy to pay for that, so you can have your large jacuzzi or swimming pool in the garden, then people will obviously pay that, because it's the difference between £5 or £10 possibly in some places. So I think it's about raising the awareness of that challenge, and getting people to understand that by saving water, it's not just saving water for them or saving money, but you're saving water for the environment, you're helping prolong secure supplies for the future. There's a knock-on effect of climate change, as well as the fact that you're trying to help for the, trying to help with the global picture, as well as carbon as well. So we know that at the moment, carbon kind of net zero is a big hot topic, and yet water is very rarely in that conversation. So I think it's trying to connect the dots so that people can understand reducing your water use helps to reduce your carbon footprint. The water industry contributes 1% of the emissions towards that. So if we can reduce how much we are distributing, supply, etc., then that is helping towards reducing our carbon footprint. And overall, it's connecting that and raising awareness through maybe campaigns, conversations, and just generally getting people to talk about water, because most activities are done behind closed doors. You don't go to the toilet and tell everybody about it, or shower with other people, and well, some people might, but generally these activities are very closed off and private, and some people have half-hour showers and think that's absolutely normal, and some people are happy to have 5 minutes. So it's kind of opening those conversations, bringing down those barriers around how we can save water, why it's important, and then linking it to the wider environment, the climate change, the climate emergency, etc.
Great. Mark, I'll come to you in a second on the question of innovation and how we address some of these big issues, but I'll just bring in Chris Davison's question. I'm not sure who wants to take it. He's asked, is desalination the answer?
So I'm quite happy to comment, because we worked on some of the largest desalination projects in the world. It's the answer if you've got available supply of energy at low cost. And although we're getting more efficient desalination, it does tie to energy. Now, if you've got a renewable source of energy, then you've got quite a good solution, in that you may get your energy from wind or from solar, but if you can use that, then desalination is a source that doesn't impact the environment. It comes out of a huge, normally brackish water is most cost efficient. But we've worked on desalination around the world, and we've seen the cost of desalination reduce. And we've seen, as I say, and I think renewable energy is part. So I think it's part of the answer. And I must have been answering this question for about 30 years. Everybody seems to want a silver bullet, and there's a number of things that I think in parallel. Some of it is around behavioural change and reducing demand. Some of it's about making sure we're more efficient at what we do and through our distribution and through everything we've got, including down to our leaking taps. I think some of it is how we manage our land use, whether we put things on the land that pollutes the land, that pollutes the water, that then we have to remove, that becomes more energy intensive. There's a shift to that whole thinking about that whole water cycle now, the sort of one we all learned at school, and then saying, well, if we hadn't developed that, if we peel back the development, what would nature have done? What would be that natural process we work more in tune with, so that we work with the amount of water we've got, that the land soaks up the water it should, because we haven't depleted the soils, because it's intercepted by trees, because we haven't felled them. There's a sort of, just go back to O-level geography and you sort of get the answer to an awful lot of where we're moving to. And that is working in tune with that natural system, whatever you call it. We've done that at scale. We're looking at Shanghai, one of the biggest cities in the world, where the way they were dealing with extremes there was going to be building huge concrete tanks and big pipes and pumps. And we're looking at putting in more trees and green solutions and temporary storage. And hey ho, who knew it saves about 25% of the otherwise carbon intensive cost with all the other benefits. So I think there's something about us just, I'm talking about this in a simple way that we can all be on the same page with, and something that people can relate to. But it's really important that people realise they have a role to play in this. This isn't the faceless thing that is solved elsewhere. I sort of drifted off your question there, but it's interesting how desalination was the answer when we had extreme drought in Australia, And then as soon as the drought broke, everybody was saying, "Oh, this is expensive water. What are we doing?" And there was political ramifications for people having provided resilience through desal. So we're a fickle lot, and the economic pressures change. But when you don't have water, the value of it shoots up exponentially.
Yeah, and I think it is really interesting how people respond. I recently moved to Hebden Bridge, which had bad floods sort of five years ago, and there's still in one of the pubs there's a line on the wall, I think at 5.2 meters, so 5.2 feet maybe, where the flood came up to, and it's just astounding to stand there and think that's where the water got to. But there's then huge amounts of community buy-in on projects like Slow the Flow, which is all about what's done from a natural point of view to improve things. But I suppose we want to get to a point where people back these projects before it floods or before we run out of water, rather than wait for the catastrophic event. Well, Gordon, perhaps you could share some of the innovative things that are happening in the Northwest that are perhaps small scale projects that are looking to get greater scale and greater impact in the years ahead.
Yes, 1,000,001 things, as you might expect, at all different scales, and not just by United Utilities, but all sorts of different partners, as you would rightly expect in response to all that challenge and opportunity that we outlined. But one thing that United Utilities is really known for leading in the sector is its catchment management agenda, and really actively with many partners, particularly environmental NGOs, but all sorts of others, and bringing in communities increasingly, keeping the land environment, or restoring and keeping the land environment in a much more natural state, as Mark was touching on, maximising all those natural benefits that if we treat the land right, it gives us for free and forever, and addresses a lot of our resilience challenges and the affordability challenge all in one go. But of course, we spent the last 50 years intensively farming and doing all sorts of things to peatland and everything else. So some beautiful examples. United Utilities has planted over 2 million trees over the last kind of 10, 15 years already, lots in the Lake District, particularly in response to the Slow the Flow agenda, but multiple benefits for recreational access zoning, the nature benefits, choosing the right tree in the right place, not just any old tree, all of those kind of things, carbon storage, but particularly helping slow the flow. And if you think about the Carlisle flooding a few years ago, that was really quite significant and devastating for those communities. But this is the source catchments of those things, and really at scale with partners trying to work through those things. And then equally protecting the peatland, which is, if treated right, gives us all sorts of benefits for water. So it both purifies the water and takes out pollutants, which and we've been seeing over decades deteriorating peatlands, and the colour comes off as the peat degrades, and then we have to add in infrastructure, energy, carbon, chemicals at the treatment works to take it back out again, so that we can give crystal clear water to the customer. So busily trying to reverse that. But equally, again, it's peatland in a healthy condition is like a sponge. And if you walk up on the moors in Yorkshire, in pretty much anywhere on the peatland moorlands up and down the country, the water industry has been at the forefront, again with many other partners, of putting in leaky dams to hold back the flow, re-wet the peat rather than dry it out. We've installed lots of drains as a society over dozens of decades, trying to block those up and slow the flow, and you'll see these little ponds forming up on top of the moors, which allows the sphagnum mosses to grow back, and then that lays down over time. So you're sequestering away carbon, but you're locking away water most importantly. And then beautifully, it helps in a drought as well as the flood, because it gives you a slow release. So it kind of smooths out your peaks and troughs. So that's just one beautiful example, and actually it's relatively low cost. You might invest in a water treatment works, easily tens of millions of pounds to upgrade a city's treatment works, to take out that water quality problem, and so on. Actually investing in the peatland could be hundreds of thousands. You could achieve an awful lot for the same investment, let me say, at scale and pace. There is still a lot more to do, however. We've not been, the pilot studies have matured into their quite mainstream programs for the water industry and our NGO partners, but we're still a long way off having restored and properly protecting all the peatland in the country, for example. So I'd love to see further growth in that over the future. But that's just one non-technical, very environmental-based solution. Equally, we should be talking about retrofitting homes, the metering and digitization and data-rich processes, all sorts of things. I hope in the last few minutes we can also come on to.
No, absolutely. And if we start by rather than perhaps the residential question, the business question, what should business owners and senior managers be not just thinking about but doing in terms of their own water usage? Stephanie, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, so I guess something that's been fabulously adopted by, I'd say, businesses already, but could be a lot more widespread, is something like rainwater harvesting, greywater reuse. It's something that when you're building your development, or when you're obviously looking to trying to bring in some of these methods, it can be really useful because you're obviously able to flush your toilets or use with rainwater rather than fresh water. It's very expensive to do on a domestic level because you do have to retrofit houses. So we're hoping that in the future, obviously with all these new builds popping up with developments, they can try and work on water neutrality. So you're not taking any more than what you're putting back into the system, sort of thing. But definitely with businesses, I think there is a large scale sort of area they could look into, which does include all of those sorts of things, and also getting their kind of consumers on board as well. So again, back to that conversations, opening up those sort of methods of conversations and what they're doing to help better the environment, why it's important to them, linking it back to their sustainability goals possibly, or their corporate social responsibility, and trying to make it so that it's not just businesses trying to do their own thing, but employees as well, and getting that internal cultural change. Because once you can start to get someone on board and then they speak to somebody else, and then you've got that domino effect of it affecting more and more people. So I think it's not just about the bigger sort of solutions that people can do and reducing water, but it's also about the on one-to-one scale level solutions that internal colleagues can all help to do as well.
Can I just add on to that, guys? I violently agree with all of that. I'd encourage every business to look at water seriously and take a fresh perspective in their activities, pretty much no matter what the business activity. But clearly, if you're a water consumer in your process, then how fundamental is that? But just to add to what Stephanie thinks, I think people might be thinking, well, we've done that, water's cheap. We've not found the cost-effective way of doing it. But I'm not convinced that organisations are really seeing where water kind of is in other things. And so if you think about it's not only the water that you're buying to consume, but you're paying then for that discharge as well. So you've got two ends for that. And if, as Stephanie was saying, if you could reuse the grey water, you would avoid both of those charges. So you've got the double win. But then equally, typically, water, we then add energy, chemicals, other things that, again, we're paying for differently. So there's a kind of it's perhaps a slightly broader, open-minded view of water and how it links in with other things, and then you get the full cost picture and therefore the full benefit. And I think that would help make the case for businesses to actually invest. And of course, there's all sorts of tech and stuff, and there are all the water retailers will come in and offer you water efficiency audits and surveys. There's many other organisations. Go to Stephanie's website, and I'm guessing there's lots of signposting that customers do. But equally beyond the cost, I think there's that resilience element that we were touching on. How critical is water, and does an organisation know where water is critical in its process and what happens if they lost it? And both from wherever they supply it in the UK in their production site or whatever, but equally in their supply chain again, are they importing key things with water in it that could be at risk? So I think there's kind of that dual focus on it that would push it up the very immediate. Well, it costs a few pence per litre. Is kind of missing the point. Ultimately, I think there are many other drivers that a business might want to think about.
Mark, do you think it's high enough up businesses' agenda at the moment? I
don't. I think it is when they experience that shock or that stress. So when you feel it, when they experience the extreme, it can be threatening to a business. Indeed, I think it's 2 or 3 floods normally will knock out a business completely. Some businesses will suffer from one, but it's 2 or 3. We were doing some research with the Environment and Physical Sciences Research Council a few years ago around that. So I think that's the reason everyone's talking about resilience, whatever that means. So what does that resilience, how do we deal with those shocks and stresses? And for every 1% we warm, our rainfall intensity increases by something about like 11%. That means suddenly we're getting more intense storms and we're having to deal with more. That means if you're a business sited somewhere and you think, I'm not next to a river, I'm protected, you might actually be subject to a flood from a storm nearby. And if your drainage system was developed some time ago, it can easily become overwhelmed. So I think water is critical to businesses. It's also critical to all of us. Each of us is 60 to 70% water. We don't think of water like that, do we? We think of it in a tap. We don't think that we're walking round and that's what we're made up of. Mm-hmm. And I think that connection or that disconnection is probably, it's something that we've lost in our society that others have found. And that connection or being in tune with that cycle or those extremes, we aren't very good at. We haven't learned very much as a society, have we? We cram more and more people into less space, and then we have more and more intensive food that uses more and more water, and then we wonder why we're starting to run out. And I think there's something about breaking that back down in the way Stephanie does it. I think it's a personal, domestic and business level through WaterWise, and Gordon does it at a district to a catchment level at a water company. And then I'm trying to look at it from place to place, normally just sharing learning from one place to another. But it is that disconnect or appreciation. Just one thing you did touch on earlier that I thought was really important. Just remember when we have long dry periods, that's where wildfires get triggered. So that's where heat waves that kill people, that's when they occur. So there's a number of things that happen when it gets dry that's, to me, it's water plus shocks and stresses. And we've got to understand that in the round if we're going to solve the challenge for society. Because just solving our bit isn't enough. We need to start engaging multi-agency, where we're working with local authorities, with local people, so that we're trying to solve those problems in a much more joined up way. Sorry to add a bit, but I've missed a bit.
No, that's great. And that actually leads me on to the question I was going to ask around trade-offs, really, because often it's easy to talk about the nice things to do or the easy things to do, and much harder to say, well, what are the difficult choices? I know, Stephanie, you'd made a sustainability pledge around fast fashion and meat consumption and reducing those. And you know, I know that I'm one of those people who would struggle to reduce my meat consumption or would do it grumpily. But you know, how do we address those trade-offs that are harder to do? Stephanie, I'll point that in your direction.
I guess it's making, trying to make the trade-offs between something that you really value. So, for example, if you really love having a bath because that's your downtime, that's your time to relax, then obviously by all means, we're not going to tell you, don't ever have baths because they use 80 litres each time. It's kind of finding that instead of maybe having 7 baths a week, you have 1 bath a week or 1 bath a month, and that's your sort of joy, and you get to enjoy and your relaxation. Likewise, perhaps going completely vegan is possibly not for some people, and rightly so. I mean, I would probably call myself a flexitarian because I, again, do love a steak every now and then. And I know the water embedded in that and the kind of the sort of impacts, I suppose. But then on the other hand, I will go and reuse water. I'll have a water butt. I've got solar panels. There's like lots of other different things that you can do to sort of mitigate some of that water use. And even just thinking of, I mean, we've talked about embedded water in food and fashion and clothes and things like that. But people don't know that there's so much water that goes into things like sending an email. Everything we do in terms of business, to run your business, you use water, and it's about 10 litres every email you send. It's about 10 litres for every piece of paper you print. So there are things you can do, for example, reducing how many emails are sent, reducing how much you're printing, trying to think of those smaller things that would be a lot easier to do than maybe completely cutting out meat, and just trying to choose where you think you can make small differences, because small differences all add up on a larger scale.
Mark, what are some of the trade-offs that come to your mind?
So it's interesting. We talked about water wars earlier. I think some research was done that found about 10%, that water wars represents about 10% of the agreements where people had fallen out, but about 90% brought people together. And I always thought that was quite an interesting dynamic about trade-offs and treaties about where water goes even between countries. Absolutely fundamental, because water is essential for life, and in many places that's felt a lot more than it is where we are. Those treaties become the things that really, I think, have brought countries together, or indeed have led, as you rightly say, to some fallout. But that assumes, let's say the world's flat and everything's static and we have this equilibrium of the odd extreme, because that's what our weather is. The world isn't flat, it's round. We've got a much more dynamic system. Our climate's changing down to our own activities, and we're getting more extremes. And what that's doing is putting pressure on those agreements. They're putting pressure on those trade-offs. And increasingly, I think you're going to find that, is the priority agriculture? Is it industry? Is it domestic? And those things play out. I've seen in places like Mexico, where Mexico City's relying on water coming from other catchments, but there's no control from that city in the other sources of water around how the agriculture's used. So suddenly they're finding they've got less water than they thought they could rely on, because they don't have the influence. So city boundaries don't normally extend to the catchments that they rely on for the water. So there's a trade-off that's required between the city then engaging with its hinterland or with its agricultural base, and there's a trade-off in what we use our land for as well. And so, but water does lie. It might be because that's what my interest is, or that's what my career's been in. But it always seems to lie at the heart of virtually everything. It underpins so many things, yet it's so often overlooked and ignored. So I would say, trade-offs aren't a bad thing, but you've really got to understand the dynamics of the systems that you're trading one thing off with another. And we're increasingly looking at systems and the dependencies and interdependencies on each other, rather than just discrete elements where we might have a separate trade-off transaction.
Great. And Gordon, I'm conscious of time, but I will let you have the final word on water. Give me something upbeat to finish on. Give me a positive, optimistic note.
Very briefly, I'm conscious of the clock, but the key positive piece, if I can even speak, is a lot of the technological solutions are here. We know a lot of the answers. There's plenty we can be doing. It's not like we don't know what we need to do through a lot of this. We just need the political and social motivation to prioritize it. And really, my trade-off is only time. Do we stay ahead of climate change and act and invest, or do we wait and respond after? Because we will respond after the flood. Do we want to avoid the flood, avoid the drought, and invest early? That's really my trade-off. But the gift is there. That's the positive piece. We just need to look at it more.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, Mark, and Gordon. That's been a fascinating 45 minutes. That's flown by. And I'm going to have to rethink whether I have steak for tea later on. And that's also our final session of the day. So thank you, everyone, for joining us in the Circle Northwest and for your contributions, whether as a panelist or in the chat and in networking. I hope you've been informed and inspired at some point during the day. I know one of my takeaways will be, knowing that Billie Eilish's rider includes no single-use plastics, which is something I will trot out in conversations from now on. A couple of quick thank yous to finish off to our sponsors, to Squire Patton Boggs and Music Magpie, as well as Audley, Whitecap Consulting and the Northern Paris Investment Fund. We'll be writing up all the sessions on thebusinessdesk.com in the next 24 hours or so, and you'll be able to replay all of the sessions that we've had on today if there are any you want to watch again, or if you missed first time round. But thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Well chaired, Alex. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.